Joseph DeAngelo, mental health and personality factors. Janelle Cruz lived at 13 Encina in Irvine, California. She was the Golden State Killer's last known victim. He broke into the house and attacked her in her bedroom. Leading up to the murder, he would make a series of obscene phone calls. In this episode, I will explain why I believe that this type of serial killer needs to go down in history as a cold-blooded psychopath hiding in plain sight, who is inhumane and cruel beyond comprehension. If there is just one thing I want you to take away from this episode, is that we need to look out for the warning signs in people. A person can appear to be a certain way on the surface, but the reality of who they are can be the opposite of what they appear to be. If you're interested in true crime, it's necessary to know about the Golden State Killer. The Golden State Killer Part 2 terrorized and stalked his victims between 1974 and 1986 in the sunny beachside communities of California. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr., responsible for more than 13 homicides as well as numerous assaults and burglaries, eluded capture for decades. Finally unveiled as the original Night Stalker in 2018, he recently pleaded guilty to his crimes and will spend the remainder of his life behind bars. I believe he pleaded guilty purely so he could escape the death penalty. So the fact that he pleaded guilty has nothing to do with his victims. It's all to do with himself. So, mental health and personality factors, and there's a backstory. His crimes were brutal. He would enter the homes in the darkness of night and he would brandish flashlights or a gun. He would separate husband and wives. He would restrain them. The assaults were often long and vicious. No one would ever have believed that this baby-faced police officer could also be a cold-blooded serial killer. He would enjoy the power and control he had over his victims. No one could ever seem to catch him. I believe he has more victims than is currently known, possibly in other parts of the United States. He had a wife, he had children. He didn't have a criminal record. He was a family man living in an ordinary American suburb. By the time he was caught, he still lived in the same area close to where he committed some of his most savage crimes. In 2018, Joseph DeAngelo was in his early 70s. Separated from his wife, he loved riding motorcycles, he loved cooking and eating, he loved fishing. He had no idea that life as he knew it was going to come to an abrupt end. In early 2018, a sample of his DNA taken from one of his early crime scenes was extracted in a forensic crime lab and then uploaded to a site called GEDmatch, which is a public genealogy database. They were able to get a list of distant relative matches, and from there, they were able to narrow the list of relatives down to one specific suspect within 4 months. So now I'm going to analyze the mental health and personality factors of this former police officer. So, one factor, prone to deviant behavior. Criminals like the Golden State Killer are deviant individuals, and this is often a side to their character that no one else knows about, even the people that are closest to them. Examples of deviancy include antisocial behaviors such as assault, robbery, theft at a minimum. The Golden State Killer engaged in theft, stealing, and a series of burglaries in Visalia. And as we follow his criminal footprint, we see an escalation of this behavior. Another factor here, a major factor in my opinion, is prone to narcissistic injury and or extreme internal rage. At least one of the victims said that during her assault, DeAngelo would sometimes say that he hated Bonnie. Another woman said he was tiny, and it was later revealed that he was once engaged to a woman called Bonnie. So while he was assaulting some of his victims, he seemed to be also releasing his anger and pent-up rage about the failure of that relationship. And he may have felt inadequate or emasculated because he didn't feel that he was worthy, because he was tiny. His insecurities as a man may have turned into rage and anger, which he had to act out on these poor victims in order to get his gratification, because it gave him power and control. And in fact, some of his neighbors said that he could be prone to lashing out at his family, that he would sometimes leave angry messages on his neighbor's phone, or he would sometimes hear DeAngelo cursing loudly to himself. Another factor here that we see is lack of empathy. This will always be a major factor in people who are psychopathic. He didn't feel empathy for his victims. He enjoyed killing, and that's obvious, based on the amount of victims that he targeted, and there were many. Another factor here we see is sadism, someone who enjoys inflicting pain on others. Another factor here we see is narcissism, which will always be a factor in these type of criminals. They feel entitled, their need for gratification is all that matters. The fact that his victim suffered is irrelevant to him as long as he gets his gratification. This is an extreme case of NPD, but it's not the sole factor. The other three important factors are exploitation, excitement seeking, and impulsivity. The urges, the rush, the thrill of stalking, hunting, preying, and peeping, the escalation of the crimes that followed were all a result of his deviant behaviors. Psychopaths have very low impulse control, and if he'd had more control over his impulses, then maybe these crimes would not have happened in the first place. So he's caught at the age of 72, which basically means he got away with his crimes for the vast majority of his life. I don't see him living for a long time. If he lives another 10 years, I'll be very surprised. And if he does, the other tragedy here is that he's lived a longer life than most of his victims. He got to live a long, fruitful life while his victims had their lives cut short. Justice did come too late, but better late than never. His victims can finally have closure.